Okay. All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir, our Talmud Torah sponsors. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Avraham and Shaindy Kelman, in memory of their parents, Jack Bennett, in honor of Givati Brigade First Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport, Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband of 53 years, Dr. Paul Weinberg, parents Moshe ben Avraham David. Our week of learning sponsors. The Rosen and Miller families as a schus for Refuah Shalima for Chaim Yosef ben Batya, Said and Sima Haken, in honor of Rabbi Richter, Chaim Nachman, Dr. Buck, Moshe Abramson, Gabi Cohn, for graciously volunteering for making the outdoor minyan happen for Rosh Hashanah, and the Stanger and Weinberg families in honor of Dov Stanger's special birthday. We thank all of our sponsors for their generosity. Those who require a refuah, should have them bekarov, and we shall all be zochet to daven inside together, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants it to be. Hopefully bekarov. All right, well, so with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Yud Beis. Hopefully, again, you did a little bit of homework that I assigned at the end of the shir yesterday with just a couple of lines. Let's pick up in yahrzeit Hashem at the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Beishame Omrim, Ein Motziin Loas HaKatan V'Loas HaLulav V'Loas Evitar. So we'll say now we're going to begin to get into in yahrzeit Hashem some of the very interesting halachos concerning Hilchos Yom Tov. See, this actually brings up a fascinating machlokes that says as follows. Beis Shammai holds that you are not permitted to go ahead. Motzia means to do hotzah, to go ahead and carry from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hayochid. In Motziin Loas HaKatan, so you can carry a child, Loas Halulav or a Lulav, Sefer Torah, the Rosh Harabim. Ubeisil Matir, and Beisil says you're permitted. So we'll say, what's the common denominator over here? All of these items are not tzarchei achila, right? And none of these items are necessary for food consumption. In other words, the Mishnah is operating with a basic premise. And the premise is that anything you need to do for food purposes, of course, will be mutter. Because at the end of the day, that falls under the purview of ochal nefesh. But what the Mishnah is highlighting over here is Beis Shammai holds anything that's not food related, you cannot go ahead and do on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel holds that you are permitted to do so. We'll see what's at the root of that machlokes in the Gemara. It says the Gemara, Tana Kamed Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. So it was taught in front of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi as follows: Hashochet olas nedava b'Yom Tov. Listen to this case. What happens if one shechts an olas nedava? Now, we'll say, what's an olas nedava? So remember again, an ola is a carbon that is totally consumed on the mizbeach. A nedava means a voluntary offering. A voluntary offering. So remember again, a nedava can't really be brought on Yom Tov itself. The only types of karbanos that you're permitted to bring on Shabbos and Yom Tov are obligatory offerings. But an olas nedava, remember again, doesn't give you any meat because it's an ola, therefore fully consumed on the mizbeach, and it's an nedava, therefore it's not obligatory. So if a person goes ahead and shechts an olas nedava on Yom Tov, loke, you get malchus. So the Gemara says, Amarle, Amarle Chamani. Whose opinion does this reflect? It must be Beis Shammai do Amri lo aminon mitoch shehutra hotza letzorech hutra nami shelo letzorech. So I will say this is very interesting. So here the Gemara gives a very important formulation that there is the concept ultimately again of mitoch. Mitoch means essentially that once something is permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, it becomes permitted for non-ochal nefesh purposes as well. Or to see a little bit differently, because we're going to define the actual scope of ochal nefesh. What it means is once a particular act becomes permitted for food preparation activities, it becomes permitted for all activities. So Beis Shammai must hold, that actually it's easier to illustrate it than the positive. Beis Hillel will hold, mitoch shehutra l'tzorech ochal nefesh, Hutra nami shelo l'tzorech. Beis Hillel's position is once a particular action becomes permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, it essentially becomes permitted for other non-ochal nefesh purposes as well. But so just before we go on, now you can begin to understand the machlokes in the Mishnah. See, Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maaseh, you're allowed to carry on Yom Tiv. What can you carry for? Food-related purposes, right? But halacha l'maaseh, anything other than food-related purposes, you're not allowed to carry for. Beis Hillel will say, mitoch shehutra hotzah l'tzarech ochal nefesh. Once hotzah becomes permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, it becomes permitted for non-ochal nefesh purposes as well. So the Gemara says, so whose opinion is it that holds that you cannot shecht an olas nedava? So it must be Beis Shammai. Because what does Beis Shammai say? Because Beis Shammai does not subscribe to the concept of mitoch. Di Beis Hillel, because if it was Beis Hillel, ha'amri, mitoch shehutra tzaletzorech, hutra nami shalo letzorech. Because Beis Hillel holds that halacha l'maaseh, once something was permitted for tzorech ochal nefesh, it becomes permitted for non-ochal nefesh purposes as well. Now I will say, what I want to point out is something very interesting. We're going to see, I'm going to mention it now only so that there shouldn't be any confusion. Even Beis Hillel, who holds the concept of mitoch, which means that once something is permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, it becomes permitted even for non-ochal nefesh purposes, there still has to be a constructive Yom Tov purpose to what it is that you're doing. In other words, Beis Hillel will not allow you to engage in activities or in malachas just for no purpose. What Beis Hillel just says is once something is permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, you could do it either, or you could still do it for other non-ochal nefesh constructive purposes as well. So now let's plug this back in. So therefore, the Gemara says as follows. When we had a statement that said that if you shecht an olas nedava on Yom Tiv, you're loke, which means again it is asur to shecht an olas nedava. So whose opinion is that? The Gemara posits it must be Beis Shammai, because according to Beis Hillel, we would say that once shchita is permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, then what? Is permitted for other non-ochal nefesh purposes as well, i.e. the shchita of an olas nedava. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami, mitoch shutra shchita l'tzorech, chutram shlo l'tzorech. Maskiv la Rava. So Rava says, 1 second. Mimai Beis Shammai Beis Hillel b'haplagi. So we'll say, so now, the reason the Gemara brings up this case is, as I mentioned before, this case sheds light on the Mishnah. So therefore, Beis Shammai will say, on Yom Tiv, you can't carry a baby, you can't carry a lulav, and you can't carry a Sefer Torah. Because the heter to carry is only for food-related purposes. Beis Hillel will say, not true. Once carrying is permitted for food-related for food-related purposes, it becomes permitted for other non-food but yet constructed permitted purposes as well. To which the Gemara says, Maskif la Rava. This comes on Rava, and Rava asks as follows: Mimai de Beis Shammai u Beis Hillel b'hapligi. Who says that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing on this? Who says that this is the point of contention? Dilma be'erev v'hotzah l'Shabbos ve'ein erev v'hotzah l'Yom Tov kamiflagi. Maybe I will say what they're arguing about is a much more yisodistic machlokes about whether or not the concept of erev and hotzah apply to only Shabbos and not Yom Tov, or does it apply to Shabbos and Yom Tov as well? So we'll say, let's take a step back. Everyone agrees that the concept of, now remember, when we say erev and hotzah, it's the same thing. In other words, if there's a prohibition of hotzah, a transferring an item from one domain to another, then we have which concept? Which concept applies? Erev. So Rava wants to suggest maybe the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is whether or not the entire concept of Erev and Hotzah applies to Yom Tiv at all. Perhaps Erev and Hotzah is only a concept which is applicable by Shabbos, but doesn't apply by Yom Tiv. Maybe that's what they're arguing about. Mar Savar, Erev Hotzah l'Shabbos, Erev Hotzah l'Yom Tiv. So Beis Shammai will hold that Erev and Hotzah apply both by Shabbos and Yom Tiv. Umar Savar, Erev Hotzah l'Shabbos, ve'ein Erev Hotzah l'Yom Tiv. And the other opinion will say, that this is Beis Hillel, Erev and Hotzah apply for Shabbos, but Erev and Hotzah do not apply for Yom Tov. In other words, maybe this isn't a machlokes about mitoch. This is just, mitoch is just the shorthand way of saying, mitoch shehutra litzorech ochal nefesh, hutra nami shalo litzorech. Once something is permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, it is permitted for other non-ochal nefesh constructive purposes as well. So the Gemara says, maybe that's not the machlokes. Maybe it's a much narrower machlokes, namely, does the concept of Hotzah and Erev apply to Yom Tiv or not? That's the machlokes. Beis Shammai says it does. Beis Hillel says it doesn't. So the Gemara says, Umar Sar Erev Hotzah Shabbos Ve'Erev Hotzah Yom Tiv. Kidich Rabbi say, now what is this machlokes based on? So here's what's interesting, because the pasuk says, "V'lo sotziu masa mibatechem b'yom haShabbos." Rabbi say, now remember, it's important to understand. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, "Ve'ein erev hotzah, v'afagav de'ikar hotzah miya'aviru kol b'machane nafka." But so we'll say, remember, the pasuk of hotzah, or the concept of hotzah, is learned out biblically, and the truth is, midda oraisa. It appears that the concept of hotzah would apply both by Shabbos and Yom Tiv. The reason why there's a machlokes is because there's a follow-up pasuk in Yirmiyahu. And what does the pasuk in Yirmiyahu say? Below sotziu masa mibatechem biyom haShabbos. Yirmiyahu Hanavi says, do not carry a burden or a load from your home on Shabbos. And what do we darshan from this? B'Shabbosin biyom Tiv lo. And based on the pasuk in Yirmiyahu and the ambiguity of the biblical pasuk, we can say that the concept of hotzah dafka applies to Shabbos and does not apply to Yom Tiv. So maybe the machlokes in Beis Beis Hillel Mishnah is not a machlokes of mitoch, right? It's not a global machlokes by Yom Tiv. It's a very narrow machlokes as to whether or not the concept of hotzah and Erev apply in Yom Tiv or not. Beis Shammai says it does, and ultimately Beis Hillel says it does not. So Maskif the Rav Yosef says, if that's true, that the machlokes in Shaindy Beis Hillel is whether or not the concept of Erev and Hotzah apply on Shabbos, Elame'ata liflagu ba'avanim. Why do you have to, if that's the case, if that's the machlokes, then at the end of the day, why are you illustrating the machlokes in the case of carrying a baby, a Sefer Torah, or a lulav? Why not make it simpler? Can you carry rocks on Shabbos? I'm sorry, Yom Tiv. Can you carry rocks on Yom Tiv? This is fascinating. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, listen to Rashi's idea. Ein iser hotzah, ein iser tiltal. We'll say, so remember, in Smichas Chaver, when we learned Hilchos Muktzah, there's a three-way machlokes about what the nature of the prohibition of muktzah is. Rashi is of the opinion that the reason that there's a concept of muktzah is because Chazal were concerned that you may come to carry certain things from one rishus to another. Therefore, they instituted the concept of muktzah. Rashi therefore the Gemara explains, if there's no issue of hotzah, then what? There's no issue of muktzah. If that's the case, so now remember, we'll say, if that's the case, that the machlokes of Shaindy Beis Hillel is not a machlokes in mitoch, but it's a machlokes on whether or not the concept of hotzah applies on Yom Tiv, then why illustrate the machlokes with a baby, a lulav, and a Sefer Torah? Just illustrate the machlokes of rocks. Beis Shammai says you can't carry rocks on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel says you can. And then I would realize, what's the machlokes? Is there an isser of hotzah on Yom Tiv? I finish that Rashi. Liflagi ba'avanim. Ein isser hotzah, ein isser tiltul. If there's no prohibition of hotzah, then there is no prohibition of carrying, of moving something, no issue of muktzah. Shelo ne'esar tiltul ela mishum hotzah. Because at the end of the day, the isser tiltul is only there because, what I will say, again, this is Shitas Rashi in muktzah. Rashi holds that the only reason there's a concept of muktzah is that Chazal did not want me inadvertently carrying things from one domain to another. Pretty incredible. Then goes in Gzeir ala tzibur ela imkin rov tzibur yachal. So you'll say to yourself, well, 1 second, if that's the case, that you're not allowed to carry, according to Rashi, the Isra Muktzah is so you don't come to go ahead and what? Carry things from one domain to another. Then the Isra Muktzah should devolve on what? Everything. Everything. Says to which Rashi says that's impossible. You can't do that. Obviously, again. So what Chazal did essentially is they put the Isser Muktzah on things that are not necessary for Shabbos. Right? The common denominator amongst Muktzah items is you can get by on Shabbos without them. So again, just an interesting idea. So the Gemara says, Midalo miflagi ba'avanim. But here's what's interesting. From the fact that the Mishnah does not frame the machlokes with stones, Shma mino ba'hotzah shelo litzorech pligi. What do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, that the machlokes is not about hotzah, but rather again the machlokes is about hotzah shelo litzorech, namely mitoch. In other words, we'll say Zimmer's making a very compelling argument. If the machlokes was really about does the Isser hotzah apply on Yom Tov or not, if that really was the machlokes, then the best way to illustrate that machlokes is to go ahead and what? Frame it as talking about the movement of stones. The fact that it specifically talks about a baby, a lulav, a sefer Torah, which are all things that are what? Necessary for Yom Tov, indicates that the machlokes Hashem Beis is not about outsah. The machlokes Hashem Beis is about what? The concept of mitoch. Beis Shammai does not hold of mitoch. Beis Hillel does hold of mitoch. Va'af Rabbi Yochanan savar b'mitoch shehutra otzah letzorech hutra mishlo letzorech pligi. And even Rabbi Yochanan agrees that the machlokes Hashem Beis Hillel is not about hotzah, but rather machlokes Hashem Beis Hillel is about mitoch. The Tani Kameid Rabbi Yochanan, I will say this is an interesting case. Hamevashal gid hanosha bechalav biyamtiv. Listen to this case, I will say. So you cook a gid hanosha, right? The gid hanosha is the sciatic nerve. You cook it in milk on yamtiv and you eat it. Va'achlo. So I will say, so what's the halacha? Lo kechamesh. You get 5 sets of malchus. I will say, I just want to point out, some averos are worth it. Right? This is not. Let's go on record, right? Sometimes the taiva is just the taiva, right? And I know it's wrong, and I know that there's a punishment. Again, what would possess a person to go ahead and do this? I just want to point out, let's say, at least if you order a cheeseburger, right? It's 2 sets of malchus, right? It's basar b'chalav and tarfus, right? Gidanosha b'chalav is going to be 5 sets of malchus. So why 5? Watch this. So the Gemara says, here we go. Lo mishum mavashal gid. So first of all, you're going to get malchus for cooking the gid with chalav, right? So remember again, the act of making, by the way, this also assumes, there's another sub-machlokes as to whether or not the gid hanosha is considered to be basar or not, right? So obviously you're working under the assumption that gid is basar. So set of malchus number 1 is you've cooked a gid. You've cooked a gid. We'll discuss that. Right? You cooked a gid. Number two, now what I want to point out over here is that what the Gemara is saying is the act of cooking the gid on Yom Tiv is aser. Okay? The Gemara says, you'll get another set of malchus, ultimately again for eating the gid. Number 3, so I'll say, so remember again, the first act, just to be clear, the first time the Gemara said mevashal is the Gemara saying the act of cooking the gid on Yom Tiv is aser. That act of cooking is aser. It's an aser act of cooking, right? That's malchus number 1. Malchus number 2 is you're eating the gid. Malchus number 3 is you're cooking basar b'chalav, right? And the act of cooking basar, independent of consumption, right? The Torah relates the prohibition of milk and meat 3 times. 1 to teach you're not allowed to make it, you can't cook it, you can't eat it, and you can't get benefit from it. Number 4, v'lo mishum ochal basar b'chalav. Then you're going to get another set of malchus for eating basar b'chalav, and then again v'lo mishum havara. And you also get malchus why? For kindling the fire. Now both say what we are most focused on is 1 and 5, right? Because remember what was number 1? You're chayiv for the act of cooking the gid on Yom Tiv. And number 5, you're chayiv for kindling a fire for cooking on Yom Tiv. Amrle, so we'll say, watch this. So remember again, this was taught before Rabbi Yochanan. When Rabbi Yochanan heard this, he said to the person who said it over, Puk Tani Libra, get this out of the base medrash, right? Get this out of the base medrash. And one nice way of saying, I think you may be incorrect. Why? Havara ubishul eina mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan said you're only chayiv 3 things, right? You're chayiv for eating the gid, you're chayiv for cooking basar b'chalav, and you're chayiv for eating basar b'chalav. But you are not going to be chayiv for what? For cooking and kindling, 1 and 5. Why not? So the Gemara says, Puk tani lebra, havara ubishal ain't a mishnah. Because you're not going to be chayiv for kindling and for bishal. So the Gemara says, now we'll say, why not? Why not? Because Rabbi Yochanan is obviously of the opinion, like Beis Hillel, that once, what mitoch shehutra tzorach ochal nefesh, chutra nami shelo letzorach. Once something becomes permitted for ochal nefesh purposes, it becomes permitted even for non-ochal nefesh purposes. So once bishul becomes mutter, it's mutter for all purposes. Once havara becomes mutter, it's mutter for all purposes. V'im tim tzalomar mishnah. And if you want to say this brayse is correct, beishamaihi the amri lo amrina mitoch shehutra letzorech chutra nami shelo letzorech. Hachanami lo amrina mitoch shehutra avar letzorech chutra nami shelo letzorech. So we'll say, and again, Rabbi Yochanan says, and if you want to push and you want to say no, the brayse is correct, the brayse clearly reflects the view of Beis Shammai, who do not subscribe to the concept of mitoch. Di Beis Hillel, because if it reflected the view of Beis Hillel, kevan da amri mitoch shutra otzar letzorech, chutra nami shelo letzorech. Hachanami mitoch shutra abar letzorech, chutra nami shelo letzorech. So I will say, so therefore again, Rabbi Yochanan wanted to suggest that the brayse was flawed. But if you want to say it's correct, it reflects the rejected view of Beis Shammai. So we'll say, how do we paskin here? We paskin like Beis Hillel. But we paskin like a little bit of a modified Beis Hillel. Meaning what? That we subscribe to the concept of mitoch. That once a particular melacha becomes permitted for the sake of ochal nefesh, it becomes permitted for non-ochal nefesh constructive purposes as well. But the operative term over here is constructive. The truth is, as we're not finished with the sugya, we're gonna come back to it. We're gonna see it's not just constructive; it also has to be normative. So I will say. So, for example, we're going to see later on: are you allowed to burn incense on Yom Tiv? That's what you like to. So the Gemara is going to pass, and the answer to that is no. But kindling. Why don't we say mitoch shehutra havara? Once havara is permitted for ochal nefesh, is permitted even for non-ochal nefesh. That's true, as long as it's a constructive, normative need. But if something is not constructive and normative, then halacha l'maisa, it is not going to be permitted. So again, we accept Beis Hillel that we subscribe to the concept of mitoch, but mitoch doesn't just. So for example, I just want to point out halacha l'maisa in this gid hanasha case, we would hold a person liable for havara and for bishul, even though, again, we subscribe to Beis Hillel's mitoch, because mitoch, again, only covers something constructive and normative. So we accept Beis Hillel, mitoch shehutra l'tzorech ochal nefesh, hutra nami shalo l'tzorech. We accept that premise, but halacha l'maisa, it has to be normative and constructive. Again, we'll fill in the rest of this construct in coming sugyas. Mishnah. Beis Shammai omrim ein molich and chala matanos l'kohen b'yom tiv. Interesting case. Beis Shammai says, you cannot go ahead and transport challah. Now, remember again, challah refers to the portion of the dough that we separate and we give to the kohen. So you cannot go ahead and transport challah and matanos. We'll say matanos, Rashi points out over here, refers to what? Matanos is hazroa v'halichayim v'hakeva. So the zroa is the foreleg, the lechaim is the jaws, right? And keva, and the stomach. These are all the gifts. When you slaughter an animal, these are the portions you give to a kohen. So Beis Shammai says, Ein molich in challah u'matanos l'kohen b'yom tiv. You cannot go ahead and give challah or these gifts to a kohen on Yom Tiv. Now, both say, now why not? Why not? So Rashi points out over here, v'kulan mishum gezerah dein mabinos. So now, both say, we're going to see that there is a rabbinic prohibition of separating out trumas and maasros on Yom Tiv, right? And the reason for that is because the act of separating out trumas and maasros has the appearance of what? Tikkun mana, like you're fixing something. Now, because you are permitted to shecht, therefore by definition, you could separate out the kohanic gifts. So I want to point out over here, and same way that you can go ahead and make a dough, you can also what? Go ahead and separate challah on Yom Tiv, right? You could do all of those things. But halacha l'maisa, what the machlokes over here is, can you take it to the kohen on Yom Tiv? That's going to be the machlokes. That's going to be the issue. So the fact that since I'm allowed to make dough, I can separate challah. Since I'm allowed to shecht an animal, I can separate out the matanos. The shaila is, can I take it to the kohen on Yom Tiv or not? So Beis Shammai says, you can't. You can't. Whether you separated them yesterday or whether you separated them today, Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel says that it's mutter. Amr lahem Beis Shammai. So Beis Shammai says gzer shava. I'll tell you how I'm right. It's the gzer shava. What's the gzer shava? Chala umatanos matana lekohen. Because think about this. Chala, separation of chala, and matanos. Matanos also refers specifically to the portion separated from a slaughtered animal, are a gift to the kohen. Uchuma matana lekohen. Truma is also a gift to the kohen. Kishem shein molichin es truma, kach in molichin es hamatanos. The same way that on Yom Tov you can't take truma to the kohen, you also what? You also can't take the other matanos to the kohen. Amr lahem Beis Hillel lo im amartem betruma sheno zakai b'haramasa tomru b'matanos shezakai b'haramasan. To which Beis Hillel says the comparison is not fair. Why is it not fair? You're not allowed to separate out trumas on Yom Tov, but you can separate what? Chala and matanos. So we'll say, so again, what's interesting about this case is what everyone agrees with, right? Pretty much everyone agrees on the basic principles, which are you can't separate out truma on Yom Tov, right? That everybody's agreed with. And you can what? What can you separate? Chala and matanos. And just to understand the logic in that is very simple. Since I'm allowed to bake bread, I could separate chala. Since I'm allowed to shecht, I could separate out the matanos. The machlokes is can you take the chala and matanos to a kohen on Yom Tov? Beis Shammai says no. Beis Hillel says yes. Beis Shammai says the same way you can't take truma to a kohen on Yom Tov, you also can't take chala and matanos. Beis Hillel says it's apples and oranges. You can't take truma to a kohen on Yom Tov because you're not allowed to separate truma on Yom Tov. But chala and matanos, which you can separate on Yom Tov, you can transport to the kohen as well. Says the Gemara, kasaka daitcha shomra me'ayom v'shenishchetu me'ayom v'shuru me'emesh v'shenishchetu me'emesh. So we're assuming over here that the machlokes Yesham Beis Hillel is both in a case where the chala was separated or the animal was shechted on Erev Yom Tov or on Yom Tov. That in both cases Beis Beis Hillel argue. If you have chala and you have matanos on Yom Tov, whether again they were separated on Erev Yom Tov or separated on Yom Tov itself, there is a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about whether or not they can be transported to the kohen. If that's the case, the Gemara says, Mani Masnisin, whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? Lo Rabbi Yossi, v'lo Rabbi Huda, el achirim. It must reflect the view neither of Rabbi Huda or Rabbi Yossi, but rather Rabbi Achirim. We'll say now we're going to go through these are three shitos. Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Yossi, and Achirim have three different ways of framing the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Here we go. The Sanya, Rabbi Huda, we'll say first wide line, Yud Beis, Amud Beis. Rabbi Huda, lo nechleku Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, ala matanos shur me'erev Yom Tov. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel do not disagree in the following case. That if you separated out matanos on Erev Yom Tov, and by the way, matanos means matanos or chal on Erev Yom Tov, shemolichin im hamatanos shehurmu me'ayom v'shenishchetu me'ayom. We'll see, interesting case. So according to Rabbi Huda, he holds that Beis Shammai Beis Hillel agree as follows. If you separate out chala matanos on Erev Yom Tov, Beis Shammai Beis Hillel agree that halacha l'maaseh you could take them on Yom Tov together with chala and matanos which are separated on Yom Tov. You can bring that all to the kohen. Lo nechelku, where's the machlokas? Ela laholicham b'fnei atzman. Well, this is fascinating. According to Rabbi Huda, the machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is only in one specific case, where you separated out chala and matanos on Erev Yom Tov, and you didn't bring them. Now, can you bring them by themselves on Yom Tov itself? Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin. Beis Shammai says you can't do it. Beis Hillel omrim molichin. Beis Hillel says you can. And this is how Beis Shammai arrived at their position. They said as follows: Chala matanos matana lekohen. Chala and matanos are a gift to the kohen. Truma matana lekohen. So is truma. Kishem shem molichin as truma. Kach in molichin as matanos. The same way that you can't take truma to a kohen on Yom Tov, you also can't take the matanos. Avraham Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel said no. Lo imamarte betruma sheni zakai b'haramasa. Truma's difference is Beis Hillel. Why? You're not allowed to separate out truma to begin with. Tomer b'matanos shezakai b'haramasan. Other matanos, you're permitted to go ahead and separate. As we'll say. So again, Shitas Rabbi Huda is quite fascinating. Shitas Rabbi Huda is that the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is in one very specific case, namely, if you separated matanos and chala on Erev. Let me work backwards. According to Rabbi Huda, Beis Shammai Beis Hillel agree that what? Anything matanos chali separate on Yom Tiv, what can be taken to the kohen. And they also agree that if you separated out matanos and chala on Erev Yom Tiv, and you have additional matanos and challah from Yom Tiv, that you could take the ones from Erev Yom Tiv together with the ones from Yom Tiv and give it to the Kohen. According to Rabbi Yehuda, they only disagree in one specific case, where you have challah and matanos from Erev Yom Tiv, no challah and matanos on Yom Tiv. Can you take those challah and matanos from Erev Yom Tiv and bring them to the Kohen by themselves on Yom Tiv itself? Beis Shammai says no. Beis Hillel says yes. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi, no. Lo nechlaku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel al matanos shemalichin. Lo nechlaku el ala truma. Both say, watch this. Rabbi Yossi says, in fact, Beis Shammai Beis Hillel agree that halacha l'maisa you could always take matanos, right? So matanos also means you could take challah. You could take matanos to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. That's not a problem. What's the machlokes? Truma. Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin. Beis Shammai says you can't take truma to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel omrim molichin. Beis Hillel says you're allowed to. The kach haya Beis Hillel danin. And how did Beis Hillel arrive at their conclusion? They said as follows. So kach haya Beis Hillel danin chalu matanos danin chalu matanos matana leKohen. Chala and matanos are a gift to the Kohen. Utruma matana leKohen, and truma is also matana to the Kohen. Kishem shemolichenes hamatanos. The same way that everyone agrees that you could take matanos, kach molichen es truma. So too, you're permitted to take truma to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. Amrulin Beis Shammai says no. Lo imamartim matanos shezakai ba'aramason. Tomru b'truma shein zakai ba'aramason. To which Beis Shammai says it's totally different. Matanos you're allowed to separate on Yom Tiv. Truma, you're not allowed to separate. So both this is fascinating. In Rabbi Yossi's version of the machlokes, they agree that what? Matanos are never a problem. You can always take matanos to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. What's the machlokes? Truma. Truma. Now, to be clear, this is truma you separated before Yom Tiv. Right? Truma you separated before Yom Tiv, because you can't separate truma on Yom Tiv itself. Can you take truma to the Kohen? Beis Hillel will say yes. Beis Shammai will say no. Third version of the machlokes. Achirim omrim. Here we go, both say. The achirim say as follows. Lo nechlaku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel ala truma shein molichin. So achirim say no. No. Everyone agrees that you can't take truma to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. Everyone agrees. What's the machlokes? Lo nechlaku ela al hamatanos. The machlokes is about matanos. Shebei Shammai omrim. Here we go. Shebei Shammai omrim. Ein molichin. Beis Shammai says you can't take matanos to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. Ubeis Hillel omrim molichin. And Beis Hillel says you're allowed to. Leima. So the Gemara says, so therefore again, it would appear that whose opinion does our Mishnah reflect? The opinion of the Achirim. Because when you look at our Mishnah, right? When you look at our Mishnah seems to indicate that the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is dafkin what? Matanos and not in truma. It sounds like everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa truma you can't take on Yom Tiv. In other words, you can't take to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. Everyone agrees, of course, you can't separate it. Can't take to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. But again, the machlokes in Beis Shammai Beis Hillel ultimately again is about matanos. So leima achirim hi below Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah must reflect the view of the Achirim, not Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rava mikatoni shehurmu mehayom v'shenishchetu mehayom shehurmu katoni. So the truth is also here's the issue. Interestingly enough, it doesn't say that the matanos ultimately again were separated today. It just says ultimately what? They were separated. Uli olam shchitasan me'emesh. And in reality, we could even be talking. Perhaps it could be Rabbi Yehuda, therefore not the Achirim. Afilu tema Achirim. The truth is, it could even reflect the view of the Achirim. Ubahanach dinishchetu me'emesh. And we're talking therefore about animals which were slaughtered yesterday. And I both said the machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda, between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel could be about the taking of matanos to a Kohen from a carbon which was shechted yesterday. In other words, it could very well be that they agree that if the animal is shechted on Yom Tiv, or the challah separated on Yom Tiv, that's what? Then halacha l'maisa you can take that to the Kohen. And maybe the machlok is only in a very specific case where halacha l'maisa, the animal was shechted, or what? Or the challah was separated yesterday. In that case, can you take it to the Kohen? Ihachi, hain Rabbi Yehuda. If that's the case, aren't the Achirim and Rabbi Yehuda essentially saying the same thing? Ika b'naihu tfela. Both say ultimately again the nafkamina between the Achirim and Rabbi Yehuda would be tfela. We both say, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. It's right across in Rashi. Tfela. Watch this. Rabbi Yehuda matir letapel ulaholich shal emesh im shalayom. So let's listen to this. In the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda is like this. that Beis Hillel, who allows you to go ahead and take the matanos, right, and to take the challah that was separated on Yom Tiv, would allow you to also bundle in that what? Anything that was separated the day before, right? That's what it means, latapa. That's how it means to add on. So in Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, Beis Hillel, who allows you to take challah and matanos that were separated on Yom Tiv, would also allow you to bundle challah and matanos which were separated the day before. V'achirim savri dafilu letapel nami asri beishamai. But ultimately, again, the achirim would hold that even bundling is something that Beis Shammai would have a problem with. Perhaps our Mishnah is not talking about bundling at all. Good. So let's just do one more line, then we'll stop. Let them dive in here. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yossi. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yehuda's name is Shmuel, that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. Namely, what Rabbi Yossi, that remember what did Rabbi Yossi say? That halacha l'maisa Beis Shammai still do not argue on matanos. Right? Namely, matanos can be taken to the Kohen on Yom Tiv. And the logic behind that is what? Since it can be separated on Yom Tiv, therefore what? It can be taken on Yom Tiv as well. So the Gemara says, Kalach Rabbi Yossi, Rav Tuvi Braid Rav Nechemia. So okay, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up again. We'll finish up the halacha l'mais with the sugya Rav Yossi. But understand, again, I wanted just to read that line because that seems to, we'll see if that is indeed the halacha l'maisa. But understand that what we have over here is a machlokes Hisham Beisil in the Mishnah and a three-way machlokes about how to interpret that particular machlokes. The halacha l'maisa resolution in Yahrzeit Hashem tomorrow.